Welcome to Calming Bedtime Historian channel. Tonight we step quietly into a lonely prairie cabin surrounded by endless snow, where the wind never truly rests and every warm breath matters. You may think frontier winters were simply cold seasons with extra blankets and larger fires, but the truth waiting inside these wooden walls feels far stranger. How did families survive months without roads, fresh food, or certainty that help could ever arrive? What happened when storms buried entire homes beneath drifting snow while wolves wandered somewhere beyond the darkness? And why did many settlers later describe prairie silence as more frightening than the storms themselves? So before you settle into the story, take a second to like the video and hit subscribe. And while you are here, leave a comment sharing your location and local time. Somewhere in the world, another listener may also be drifting towards sleep beside soft winter weather tonight. Now dim the lights, and imagine yourself standing at the edge of an enormous white prairie sometime during the late 19th century. Snow stretches endlessly beneath a pale grey sky. The land appears almost empty at first glance. No glowing towns wait nearby. No highways cut through the frozen distance. Only grasslands sleeping beneath winter and an arrow trail nearly swallowed by drifting snow. Your boots sink deeply with every careful step forward. The cold touches your cheeks immediately. It feels dry and sharp, like tiny needles brushing your skin each time the wind rises again. You pull your heavy wool coat tighter around your body while breathing through a thick scarf, already damp with frozen breath. Ahead, you finally notice the cabin. It stands alone, small beside the enormous prairie. The structure looks rough and weathered, built from timber, hauled across difficult distances many years earlier. Smoke curls weakly from a stovepipe above the roof, though the wind keeps tearing it sideways before it can rise properly into the sky. Frost clings to the cabin windows in cloudy white patterns that resemble pale river branches. You approach slowly, hearing the snow crunch beneath your boots in steady rhythm. Somewhere far behind you, the wind pushes through dry grass hidden under deep drifts. The sound resembles waves rolling against a distant shore. Strange, really. An ocean made entirely from frozen land. A well-established historical reality reveals that prairie settlers often live many miles from their nearest neighbors during severe winters. Some families spend weeks completely isolated after heavy storms block trails and buried fences beneath snow. Even experienced travelers sometimes vanished while attempting short journeys across the plains. You reach the wooden door and knock carefully against the cold surface. Almost immediately you hear movement inside. Boots scrape softly across the floorboards. Metal rattles somewhere near the stove. Then the door opens slowly inward. Warmth spills outward first, then the smell. Wood smoke mixes with stew-damp wool and old pine boards heated continuously through winter nights. After the freezing wind outside, the scent feels oddly comforting, almost heavy. You step inside gratefully while snow melts from your boots onto the rough wooden floor. The cabin interior appears smaller than you expected. One room serves nearly every purpose imaginable. Cooking, sleeping, sewing, eating, waiting, surviving. A cast-iron stove glows softly near the center, radiating precious heat into the cramped space. Beside it sits a kettle, releasing gentle steam into the dry air. Bunks line one wall beneath quilts stitched from mismatched cloth pieces. Shelves hold jars of preserved beans, dried herbs, and carefully rationed flour. Nothing feels wasted here, not even space. You remove your gloves slowly while your fingers sting painfully from returning warmth. That sensation surprises many newcomers to frontier winters. Extreme cold numbs the body first. Heat hurts afterward. Settlers understood this feeling well, especially after long chores outdoors during blizzards. A woman near the stove stirs a pot calmly while two children sit wrapped in blankets beside the firelight. Their faces glow orange from the stove. Shadows shift gently across the ceiling every time flames move behind the iron door. Outside, the wind rises again. The cabin responds with soft creaks. You glance upward instinctively. Prairie cabins constantly spoke through tiny sounds during winter. Timber expanded near heat and tightened in cold air. Roof beams groaned during snowstorms. Loose shutters tapped against walls through the night. Some settlers claimed they eventually recognized each sound individually, almost like learning another language. One unusual frontier account described families hanging strips of fabric indoors to detect hidden drafts. When cloth moved unexpectedly, they packed additional mud or straw into wall cracks before temperatures dropped further. Historians debate how widespread this practice truly became, though several surviving diaries mention similar techniques. You settle carefully onto a wooden chair near the stove. Heat presses warmly against your boots while your back still remembers the freezing wind outdoors. The contrast feels almost dreamlike. Warm front, frozen spine. Frontier comfort often worked that way. Simple, incomplete, precious. The man of the cabin removes another log from a nearby stack and feeds the stove carefully. Every motion appears practiced and efficient. Firewood means survival here. During endless winters, families measured security partly through the size of their woodpile. A shrinking stack created quiet fear, long before true desperation arrived. The flames brighten softly, light dances across iron cookware. You notice frost lingering along the cabin corners despite the stove's warmth. That detail surprises modern imagination. Many prairie cabins never became fully warm during severe cold spells. Areas near the fire remained comfortable enough, but distant walls often stayed freezing throughout winter nights. The children whisper quietly together, while tracing patterns into condensation gathered along the window edges. Beyond the cloudy glass, snow continues falling sideways across the prairie. You can barely see the fence outside anymore. Another storm approaches. No one seemed surprised. That was the strange rhythm of prairie winters. Storms arrived repeatedly across open grasslands with very little protection from wind. Some blizzards lasted several days. Others returned immediately after brief moments of calm. Settlers learned not to trust clear skies too quickly. You accept a bowl of stew offered carefully across the door. Steam rises toward your face, carrying scents of onion, salt pork and carrots preserved months earlier. The broth tastes rich after travelling through cold air. Not luxurious, just filling. Frontier cooking rarely aimed for excitement during winter. Calories mattered more than variety. Still, people found small comforts where possible. Extra butter on special evenings. Coffee saved carefully for Sundays. Molasses hidden from children. Tiny celebrations survived even here. The storm outside deepens gradually while darkness settles across the prairie. Wind rattles against the cabin walls with stronger force now. Snow brushes the windows in dry, whispering waves. Inside, lantern light softens every rough surface into warm gold and shadow. You begin understanding something important. Prairie winter survival depended less on heroic moments and more on endless, ordinary discipline. Keeping fires alive, repairing leaks early, conserving food carefully, watching weather signs closely, exhausting habits repeated every single day. No dramatic music accompanied frontier endurance, mostly just patience and cold fingers. The woman beside the stove finally sits down after hours spent cooking and tending heat. She rubs her tired hands together slowly while listening to the wind outside. Her expression remains calm, though not careless. Prairie settlers respected winter too much for carelessness. You listen along. Alongside her now, the cabin creaks softly again. Snow brushes the roof. Somewhere far outside, the prairie disappears deeper into darkness. And inside this lonely little cabin, surrounded by endless winter grasslands hidden beneath snow, you settle quietly beside the stove and prepare for a season that may feel almost endless itself. Morning arrives slowly across the prairie, though the word morning hardly feels accurate beneath such heavy clouds. Pale grey light presses weakly against the frosted windows, while the cabin remains wrapped in deep cold near the floorboards. You wake beneath layers of rough quilts, and immediately notice your breath drifting faintly upward in the dim air. The fire survived the night, barely. A small orange glow still pulses inside the iron stove while ash settles softly beneath it. The man of the cabin kneels beside the stove, already feeding thin strips of wood into the fading coals with careful patience. Every family feared waking to dead embers during severe winters. Restarting a fire from nothing consumed valuable matches, precious time, and stiff frozen fingers. You sit upright slowly. The blanket feels heavy and warm around your shoulders. Beyond it, the cabin air bites sharply against your skin. One foot touches the wooden floor and immediately regrets the decision. Cold rises through your wool socks almost instantly. Frontier mornings demanded courage in strange little ways. The woman near the table pours water from a kettle into cracked ceramic cups while steam curls gently toward the ceiling beams. The smell of weak coffee drifts through the cabin. Not enough beans remain for strong coffee anymore. Settlers often stretched supplies creatively during winter months, mixing roasted grains or dried root skis into coffee grounds once true beans became scarce. Still, the smell comforts everyone. Even weak coffee mattered. Outside wind brushes softly against the cabin walls. The storm from last night weakened sometime before dawn, though snow continues falling steadily across the prairie. Through the cloudy window glass, you can barely distinguish the fence line from the drifting whiteness beyond it. The children remain asleep beneath thick quilts stuffed with cotton and scraps of worn cloth. Their cheeks appear flushed from stove heat while loose frost still clings faintly along the corners of the nearest wall. Prairie cabins constantly balance between warmth and freezing temperatures during difficult winters. Heat gathered near the stove first. Distant corners surrendered slowly. You stand carefully and pull on stiff boots left drying overnight near the fire. The leather feels hard and cold despite the warmth inside the room. Many settlers slept with certain clothing items beside them, beneath blankets to prevent freezing completely by morning. Boots left too far from heat sometimes stiffened into nearly unusable shapes overnight. A recognized historical detail from frontier life explains that many prairie cabins were insulated with mud straw, sod, or even newspaper stuffed into wall gaps. Families improvised constantly because proper building materials rarely arrived easily across isolated settlements. Cabins often appeared simple from outside while hiding surprisingly creative repairs within their walls. The man opens the cabin door briefly. Cold air crashes inward immediately. Snow swirls through the doorway in pale ribbons before he shuts it again quickly. That short moment changes the entire room. The warmth retreats instantly toward the stove while everyone nearby pulls blankets and coats tighter. You understand something else now. Winter always waited nearby, even indoors. The man brushes snow from his beard while hanging another bundle of firewood beside the stove. His gloves carry the dry scent of pine sap and frozen leather. He says little, though frontier families often conserved energy through silence during long winters. Endless storms reduced conversation sometimes, not from unhappiness, mostly exhaustion. Outside chores could never fully stop. Animals still required feeding. Snow still needed clearing. Wood still had to be hauled indoors before darkness returned again. You accept a tin cup of coffee gratefully. The warmth spreads into your hands first before reaching the rest of your body. Steam fogs briefly against your face while the first sip tastes smoky and bitter. Perfect frontier coffee, honestly. More determination than flavor. The woman slices coarse bread carefully across the table. Nothing gets wasted here. Not crumbs, not grease, not daylight. Prairie survival depended heavily upon avoiding waste in every possible form. One curious prairie tradition involved hanging thick quilts across interior doorways or sleeping spaces to trap additional warmth during brutal cold spells. Some families even constructed temporary fabric ceilings inside cabins so heat from the stove remained lower within occupied areas. Researchers still debate how common these techniques became across different regions. Though several homestead journals describe surprisingly elaborate winter insulation methods, the children finally wake slowly beneath their blankets. One rubs sleepy eyes while staring toward the frosted windows. The younger child asks whether more snow arrived overnight, though everyone already knows the answer before looking outside. More snow always arrived. That became the rhythm of prairie winter. You move closer to the window now. Frost patterns spread across the glass in delicate white feathers. Some settlers believe these formations resembled forests, rivers, or angel wings, depending upon temperature changes overnight. Tiny worlds created entirely from frozen moisture. Beyond the frost, the prairie looks transformed again. Drifts lean heavily against fences. The trail disappeared completely. Snow now reaches nearly halfway up the cabin walls. You suddenly understand why travelers feared prairie blizzards so deeply during the 19th century. The land offered almost no natural shelter once storms intensified. Without trees, hills, or clear landmarks, people sometimes wandered in circles, despite standing dangerously close to safety. Several historical accounts describe settlers freezing only short distances from their own homes after losing direction in whiteout conditions. The man prepares to step outdoors again. You help him wrap scarves higher against the wind before opening the door together. Snow crunches sharply beneath your boots the moment you step outside. The cold feels immediate and enormous compared with the crowded warmth inside the cabin. The prairie stretches endlessly beneath a pale silver sky. Beautiful, merciless too. Wind sweeps loose snow across the ground in thin moving sheets that resemble ghostly water flowing over frozen earth. Your eyes water almost instantly from the cold air. Somewhere nearby, hidden beneath drifting snow, a loose shutter knocks softly against wood in steady rhythm. The cabin itself appears smaller from outdoors this morning, almost fragile against the enormous white landscape surrounding it. Yet these humble structures carried thousands of settlers through brutal winters across North America. Not comfortably, not easily, but often successfully enough. You follow the man toward a partially buried woodshed nearby. Each step sinks deeply into snow packed unevenly by drifting wind. He chops ice carefully from stacked logs while explaining that wet wood burns poorly and wastes precious heat. Frontier families learned these details quickly because mistakes carried serious consequences during endless cold. Your gloves stiffen gradually while handling frozen timber. The air smells clean and sharp. Somewhere far away, a crow calls briefly across the white emptiness before silence swallows the sound again. Then the wind rises harder. You both return toward the cabin immediately, carrying heavy armloads of wood against your chests. Snow brushes sideways across your coats while the cabin door waits ahead like the entrance to another world entirely. Warmth greets you again once inside. So does relief. The woman stirs oatmeal slowly over the stove while lantern light flickers softly despite the growing daylight outside. The children laugh quietly now, tracing shapes into frost along the windows with curious fingers. And around you, the prairie cabin continues its endless winter routine built carefully against snow silence and the patient force of cold stretching across the plains beyond sight. By late afternoon, the prairie sky darkens once again into heavy layers of grey. Snow drifts steadily beyond the cabin windows while cold gathers against the outer walls like a living thing waiting patiently outside. Inside the cabin, however, nearly every movement centres around one object alone. The stove. You begin noticing how often everyone glances toward it without thinking. The woman checks the fire while stirring supper. The children edge closer whenever the wind grows louder outside. The man studies the remaining woodpile each time another log disappears into the flames. Nothing inside this cabin matters more during winter. Not blankets, not food, not even sleep. The fire decides everything. You kneel beside the iron stove, now extending chilled hands toward its warmth. The metal surface radiates steady heat that tingles pleasantly against your skin. Tiny cracks snap softly inside burning logs while orange light flickers through narrow vents near the stove door. The smell surrounding the stove changes constantly. Pine sap, smoke, hot iron, occasionally scorched bread, sometimes damp wool steaming dry after long exposure outdoors. Together the scents create the unmistakable atmosphere of frontier winter survival. You glance upward toward the stovepipe stretching through the ceiling. A faint whistle moves through it whenever stronger wind sweeps across the prairie roof. Soot stains darken nearby boards from years of smoke and heat. Many prairie cabins carried permanent signs of their fires everywhere along ceilings and walls. A firmly documented historical fact explains that cast iron stoves transformed frontier life during the 19th century. Earlier settlers often relied entirely upon open hearth fires for cooking and warmth. Iron stoves burned fuel more efficiently, heated cabins faster, and allowed families to survive colder regions with greater consistency. Even so, stoves demanded constant attention during severe winters. The man demonstrates how carefully the dampers must be adjusted throughout the day. Too much airflow burns valuable wood too quickly. Too little suffocates the flames entirely. Prairie families learned these small details through experience, usually after several miserable mistakes. You listen while snow taps softly against the windows. The cabin creaks again. Somewhere beneath the stove, ash settles with a faint sighing sound. Tiny noises fill frontier winters once you begin noticing them. The younger child tosses another small log toward the stove too eagerly. Sparks burst briefly upward when the door opens. The woman reacts immediately, pulling the child backward gently before loose embers touch nearby blankets. Fire-protected prairie families. Fire threatened them too. That uneasy balance followed settlers constantly. Many frontier cabins stood far from organized towns or firefighting help. A single overturned lantern or stray spark could destroy everything within minutes, especially during dry, windy conditions. Some homesteaders reportedly slept lightly for years because they feared cabin fires almost as much as blizzards. You study the rough wooden bucket standing beside the door. Snow melted into water fills it halfway. Emergency protection, simple but necessary. The man settles onto a stool beside the stove while repairing a leather harness stiffened by freezing weather. His fingers move carefully through the warm lantern glow. The leather smells earthy and sharp once heated near the fire. Outside, wind begins rising again. Not violently yet, just steadily. The sound moves across the prairie in long, hollow breaths that brush against the cabin walls. You notice the children glance toward the windows each time stronger gusts arrive. Even after weeks or months of winter storms, still unsettled people living across isolated plains. You understand why. The land never truly allowed comfort to become permanent. One unusual prairie rumor claims certain settlers carried heated stones beneath blankets at night to prevent freezing during extreme cold spells. Historians remain uncertain how widespread this practice actually became, though archaeological discoveries near several homestead sites revealed smooth stones blackened repeatedly by fire exposure. Whether common or rare, the idea itself feels perfectly suited to frontier winters. The woman hangs wet mittens closer beside the stove now. Steam rises gently from them while droplets hiss against hot iron whenever they fall too near the surface. Drying clothing became another endless winter routine inside prairie cabins. Snow-soaked boots constantly, wool-trap moisture, gloves stiffened with ice after outdoor chores. Nothing ever stayed dry for long. The older child begins reading softly from a worn Bible near the lantern. Many frontier families owned very few books, especially in isolated settlements. During long winters, reading aloud provided entertainment and education and comfort simultaneously. Stories travelled slowly across the prairie, often repeated so many times that children memorized entire passages without realizing it. You lean back in your chair while warmth settles gradually through your body. The stove creates strange zones within the cabin. Nearby air feels pleasantly heavy and warm. Only a few feet farther away, cold still lingers near the walls and floorboards. Your face grows almost too warm while your boots remain chilly underneath the table. Frontier comfort always involved compromise. A sudden gust slams snow harder against the cabin. The lantern flickers. Everyone pauses instinctively. Then the moment passes. The woman resumes stirring supper, while the man adds another log carefully into the stove. That simple action calms the room almost immediately. More fire, more safety, more time. You realize how psychological the stove becomes during endless winters. The glowing iron creates reassurance beyond physical warmth. As long as flames survive inside that metal box, the cabin still holds against the enormous frozen prairie surrounding it. Outside, darkness settles. The windows turn black except for swirling snow occasionally visible in lantern glow. You hear wind dragging loose drifts across the roof overhead. The sound resembles dry sand pouring endlessly across wood. The children move closer beside the stove after supper finishes. One holds chilled hands directly above the iron surface despite repeated warnings not to touch it. Their faces appear sleepy beneath flickering light. A scholarly debate continues among historians regarding how isolated prairie winters truly affected settlers emotionally over long periods. Some surviving journals describe peaceful family closeness during storms, while others reveal loneliness, anxiety, and severe exhaustion from endless confinement. Most likely, reality shifted constantly between both experiences. Tonight the cabin feels calm, tired perhaps, but calm. The man opens the stove briefly one final time before preparing for sleep. Flames glow deeper now, slower and steadier. Larger logs burn overnight because they last longer beneath low airflow. Families often woke several times during cold nights simply to feed the stove again before temperatures dropped dangerously indoors. Sleep never fully escaped responsibility here. You help spread blankets near the bunks while shadows move gently across the ceiling beams. The smell of smoke lingers softly in every quilt and coat throughout the cabin. Outside, the storm continues building strength beyond the walls. Inside, however, the stove glows steadily through the darkness, like the heart of the entire little world around you. And as wind circles endlessly across the frozen prairie outside, you settle closer beside the fading firelight, understanding at last why frontier families spoke of their stoves almost like trusted companions during the longest winters. You wake before sunrise, though sunrise itself remains hidden somewhere behind thick winter clouds. The cabin rests in dim bluish darkness, while the iron stove clicks softly beside the wall. Ash glows faintly beneath blackened logs, casting just enough light to reveal frost spreading across the nearest window pane. The cold feels sharper this morning. Even beneath blankets you sense it immediately. Your nose tingles first, then your fingertips. The air carries that peculiar dryness common during deep prairie winters, where every breath seems to pull moisture gently from your skin. Nearby, someone shifts beneath heavy quilts while floorboards creak quietly under cautious footsteps. The woman is already awake. She kneels beside the stove with tired patience coaxing fresh flames from the remaining coals. Tiny sparks flutter upward whenever she blows carefully into the firebox. The sound resembles dry leaves rustling together. You remain still for a moment listening. Wind murmurs faintly outside. Wood settles overhead. A kettle lid rattles gently against warming iron. These sounds become strangely familiar during frontier winters. After enough weeks inside a prairie cabin, silence no longer feels truly silent. The building itself breathes constantly through cold heat and weather. You pull the blanket tighter around your shoulders and glance toward the nearest window. Frost now covers nearly the entire surface in pale branching patterns. Some edges appear delicate as feathers. Others resemble frozen rivers twisting across cloudy glass. Children on the prairie often invented stories about these icy shapes. One surviving diary from a Dakota homestead described youngsters believing frost flowers carried secret messages from winter spirits. Their mother apparently encouraged the tale because it kept the children entertained during long storms indoors. Honestly, you can understand the appeal. The prairie gives people too much time to imagine. The man rises slowly from his bunk while rubbing sleep from tired eyes. His beard appears slightly frosted near the edges from breathing cold night air beneath blankets. During especially harsh winters, moisture from sleeping bodies sometimes froze lightly against walls, quilts, and even facial hair inside poorly insulated cabins. A number of settlement records from the Great Plains reveal that nighttime indoor temperatures could drop dangerously low whenever storms intensified or firewood supplies weakened. Families frequently slept wearing layers of clothing beneath piles of blankets and animal hides to conserve warmth through the darkest hours. You finally leave the warmth of your bed. The floor punishes your decision immediately. Cold presses upward through your boots while your shoulders tense against the cabin air. The woman hands you a warm mug without speaking. Steam rises softly into the dim room, carrying the scent of chicory mixed with weak coffee grounds. You take a careful sip. Bitter. Smoky. Wonderful. Outside dawn slowly brightens the prairie in shades of silver and pale blue. Snowdrifts lean heavily against the lower cabin walls now. The world beyond the window appears soft and blurred, almost unreal beneath endless layers of drifting snow. The younger child wakes suddenly and begins tracing circles into the frost using one small finger. Clear patches appear briefly before fogging again from warm breath nearby. The child giggles quietly while drawing crooked stars and imaginary animals across the frozen glass. Simple entertainment mattered deeply here. No radios, no telephones, no crowded streets beyond the door. Only weather routine and whatever comfort families created themselves. You notice how carefully everyone conserves movement during these cold mornings. Nobody rushes, nobody wastes effort. The man adds only 2 small logs to the stove instead of several larger ones. Firewood must last the season. Every decision quietly connects back to survival. An unusual custom reported among certain prairie families involved heating bricks near the stove before wrapping them in cloth and placing them beneath blankets before sleep. Some modern researchers question how common this habit truly became across isolated settlements, though enough personal accounts mention it that the practice likely existed in colder regions. The smell of oatmeal soon joins the scent of smoke inside the cabin. It cooks slowly over the stove while tiny bubbles rise lazily through the thick mixture. You hear spoons clinking softly against bowls as breakfast preparations begin. Out up! Outside, however, the prairie remains motionless. No wagon wheels, no passing travellers. Not even birds this morning. Winter silence across open plains feels different from ordinary quiet. It seems larger somehow, as though the land itself has withdrawn inward beneath the snow. You understand why many settlers described prairie winters using ocean imagery. Endless white waves, frozen tides, storms rolling across grasslands like weather-crossing water. The older child opens the cabin door briefly to shake snow from a rug. Instant regret follows. A blast of freezing wind crashes through the room while loose snow scatters across the floorboards. The lantern flame trembles wildly before the door slams shut again. Everyone laughs softly afterward, the kind of tired laughter born from shared discomfort. You help brush snow toward the doorway, while the younger child pulls blankets tighter around small shoulders. Already the warmth near the stove begins recovering lost ground against the cold air. The man finally prepares for outdoor chores once breakfast finishes. Layer after layer disappears beneath his heavy coat. Wool scarf, thick gloves, fur-lined cap, extra socks wrapped carefully beneath stiff boots. Prairie winters punished exposed skin quickly once temperatures dropped far enough. Several frontier newspapers from the late 19th century carried warnings reminding settlers not to travel alone during severe snowstorms, particularly across unfamiliar prairie routes. Whiteout conditions erased landmarks entirely. Fence posts often became the only reliable guides back toward home. You watch through the frosted window as the man steps outside carrying a shovel. Wind immediately swallows part of his figure beneath swirling snow. Within moments he already appears distant despite standing only yards from the cabin. That sight unsettles you quietly. The prairie can erase people frighteningly fast. Inside, the woman hums softly while washing breakfast dishes in steaming water. The children sit close beside the stove reading from a weathered schoolbook with loose pages tied carefully together using thread. Life narrows during winter. Smaller spaces, smaller routines, smaller comforts. Yet strangely those comforts begin feeling larger because so little exists beyond them. You move closer toward the window din while pale daylight spreads weakly across the endless snow outside. Frost slowly melts near the stove side of the glass, allowing clearer glimpses of drifting whiteness beyond the cabin. And there, inside this tiny wooden, the shelter surrounded by frozen prairie. Another winter morning unfolds through warmth, patience, and the quiet determination required simply to greet the cold once more. By midday, the cabin fills with the comforting smell of simmering beans and baking bread. Outside, snow continues drifting steadily across the prairie, softening fences and swallowing narrow footpaths beneath pale rolling layers. Inside, however, attention turns toward food. Not luxury, not abundance, simply enough to continue through another freezing day. You sit beside the rough wooden table while the woman lifts a heavy iron lid from the cooking pot. Steam spills upward immediately, carrying scents of onion, salt, pork, and dried herbs saved carefully from warmer months. The smell thickens the cabin air in the most pleasant way imaginable after endless cold mornings. Your stomach notices first. Frontier winters sharpened hunger constantly. Cold weather demanded enormous energy from the human body, especially during outdoor labor. Chopping wood, hauling water, feeding animals, and walking through deep snow burned exhausting amounts of strength each day. Prairie families depended heavily upon filling meals because thin diets and severe weather created dangerous combinations. The woman ladles beans slowly into chipped bowls, while the children wait patiently beside the stove. Nobody grabs food early. Nobody wastes movement reaching querulously across the table. These habits formed gradually through necessity. You notice the portions remain modest, carefully measured. A loaf of coarse bread rests beside the kettle wrapped partly in cloth to preserve warmth. Butter appears only lightly spread across thin slices. Sugar remains hidden, somewhere out of sight, likely reserved for special moments or illness. A number of homestead journals from the American plains reveal how dependent settlers became upon preserved food during harsh winters. Families dried apples, salted pork, stored root vegetables, and canned beans months before snowfall arrived. Fresh ingredients nearly vanished once storms isolated prairie communities. The first spoonful tastes rich and smoky. Simple food often carried surprising comfort here. Beans soften slowly in your mouth, while salt pork adds deep, savoury flavour to the broth. The bread feels dense and slightly rough beneath your fingers, though wonderfully warm near the centre. You quickly understand something important. Hunger changes expectations. Meals do not need elegance when survival itself sharpens every flavour. Outside wind brushes snow against the cabin walls with a dry scraping sound. The noise comes and goes in steady waves while lantern light flickers softly across the table. One child dips bread carefully into the steaming bowl while the other watches snow gathering along the windowsill. The cabin smells alive now. Smoke from the stove, fresh bread, wet wool drying nearby, a trace of animal hide from gloves hanging beside the door. Nothing here smells clean in the modern sense. Yet the mixture feels strangely reassuring because each scent signals warmth, labour and endurance. The man reaches for a jar containing pickled cucumbers preserved during late summer. Vinegar sharpness cuts through the heavier stew flavours immediately. Prairie families often treasured preserved vegetables during winter because they broke the monotony of salted meat and dried grains. One lesser-known prairie habit involved saving bacon grease in small containers near the stove for future cooking. Nearly every scrap carried value during frontier winters. Grease-flavoured soups, fried bread, and even helped waterproof certain leather items when supplies grew scarce. You watch the younger child scrape the bowl carefully once finished. Nothing remains, not even broth. The woman smiles faintly before placing another small piece of bread beside the child anyway. Tiny kindnesses mattered deeply during hard winters. A second slice of bread, an extra spoonful of jam, small gestures softened long seasons more than grand celebrations ever could. After the meal dishes wash slowly in steaming water heated directly atop the stove. Soap smells faint and homemade, carrying traces of lye and animal fat. Your hands redden immediately when touching the warm water after spending time near cold windows and drafty corners. Outside daylight fades early beneath thick clouds. The prairie remains colourless except for muted shades of grey and white. You glance towards shelves lining the cabin wall. Jars stand ranged carefully beside sacks of flour and bundles of dried herbs hanging upside down from ceiling beams. Every remaining supply receives constant silent calculation throughout winter. How much flour remains? How quickly firewood disappears? Whether the potatoes will last until spring? Such thoughts never fully leave frontier households during difficult seasons. Several historical researchers continue examining how prairie settlers adapted recipes depending upon isolation and regional shortages. Surviving cookbooks often differed sharply from what families actually prepared during severe winters when missing ingredients forced constant improvisation. Improvisation becomes its own skill here. Coffee weakens gradually over months. Soup stretches farther with added beans. Bread includes whatever grain remains available. Nothing follows exact recipes anymore. The older child opens a small tin hidden near the stove and reveals several precious peppermint candies wrapped in paper. The sight immediately changes the atmosphere inside the cabin. Even the adults smile slightly. Candy during winter felt almost magical. The woman allows each child one piece only. You receive one too. The peppermint tastes astonishingly bright after days of smoky air and heavy foods. Sweetness spreads cool across your tongue, while the younger child closes tired eyes dramatically, as though experiencing fine luxury in a grand city hotel. Honestly, the reaction feels understandable. Tiny pleasures grow larger on the prairie. Outside, snow thickens again. You hear the wind pressing harder against the western wall now. Loose flakes slide down the chimney pipe in whispering waves while the stove crackles steadily nearby. The man rises quietly and checks the woodpile indoors once more before darkness fully settles. Always checking, always counting. A curious story recorded in one Nebraska settlement described families placing bowls of snow near sleeping areas because winter air inside overheated cabins became painfully dry near iron stoves. Some modern historians question whether this practice truly helped humidity levels or simply reflected folk tradition passed between neighbours. Still, you can imagine settlers trying almost anything for comfort during endless winters. The children soon return beside the stove carrying scraps of cloth and thread for evening repairs. Socks require mending constantly after repeated exposure to snow and rough boots. Gloves split along stiff seams. Blankets fray near the edges after years of use. Nothing escapes repair here. Things survive because people force them to survive. The cabin grows quieter while darkness deepens beyond the windows. Snow continues falling across the prairie with patient determination. Somewhere outside, hidden beneath layers of drifting white, the frozen grasslands stretch endlessly beneath the storm. Inside, however, bowls sit empty beside warm hands and fading lantern light. And for one more evening, the little cabin holds its fragile comfort against the cold waiting patiently beyond its walls. The storm finally weakens sometime during the night, leaving behind a strange heavy stillness across the prairie. Morning light spreads pale and quiet through the frosted windows while the cabin settles gently around you with familiar creaks and soft stove sounds. You step outside shortly after dawn. The sight stops you immediately. Snowdrifts rise everywhere like frozen waves across the prairie. Some reach nearly as high as the cabin windows. Others bury fences completely beneath smooth white curves shaped by a relentless wind. The landscape no longer resembles open grassland at all. It feels transformed into something colder, stranger, and almost endless. Your boots sink deeply with each careful step. Snow presses against your knees in certain places. Breathing the morning air feels drop enough to sting your chest slightly. Yet beneath the cold another sensation emerges too. Silence, real silence. The storm carried noise with it. Without wind, the prairie becomes almost unnaturally quiet. You hear only distant crows somewhere beyond sight, and your own breathing. The man begins clearing a narrow path from the cabin toward the woodshed, while you stand beside him holding a shovel. Snow feels heavier than expected. Each lift strains your shoulders quickly despite the freezing air. Within minutes, sweat gathers beneath layers of wool clothing. Frontier winters carried exhausting contradictions. Frozen air outside, sweat trapped beneath coats, numb fingers beside aching muscles. A collection of reports from plain settlements describe how drifting snow often trapped families indoors for days at a time. Entire barns disappeared beneath heavy storms. Livestock froze during blizzards after losing shelter, or wandering too far from fences hidden under snow. You pause beside the buried fence line, now staring across the enormous white prairie stretching outward beneath a pale grey sky. Nothing moves, not wagons, not riders, not smoke from neighbouring cabins. The world appears abandoned. The younger child steps carefully outside, carrying a wooden bucket nearly half their size. Immediately, boots disappear ankle-deep into loose drifts beside the cabin wall. The child laughs anyway, though movement becomes slow and awkward beneath heavy winter clothing. Snow changes how people move. Every action requires effort. The woman hangs blankets outdoors briefly to air them beneath weak sunlight. Frost sparkles along the fabric edges while cold air pulls lingering stove smoke from the cloth. Even chores become strange during prairie winters. You notice how sunlight reflects sharply from the snow surface. The brightness almost hurts your eyes despite thick clouds overhead. Many settlers suffered temporary snow blindness after long exposure to glare across open plains. Some improvise protection using dark fabric strips or soot, smeared lightly beneath the eyes. One unusual account from the northern plains described travellers tying ropes between cabins and barns during severe winter months, so family members could navigate safely through whiteout conditions. Modern historians generally agree such practices existed in especially isolated regions where storms erased visibility completely. Honestly, after seeing these drifts yourself, the idea sounds less dramatic than practical. The man uncovers part of the woodshed roof while snow tumbles heavily beside him in thick powdery sheets. Each falling clump lands with soft, muffled thumps. The smell of fresh pine escapes once buried logs become exposed again. Nearby, the younger child attempts climbing a drift nearly taller than the cabin porch. Halfway upward, snow collapses beneath tiny boots and sends the child tumbling backward into soft powder. Laughter echoes briefly across the quiet prairie. Small joy survives here too. That surprises you sometimes. The cold feels so enormous that happiness almost seems impossible beside it. Yet frontier families still joked, played games, celebrated holidays, and shared stories through endless winters. Human beings remain stubbornly hopeful creatures. You help shovel a wider path toward the animal shelter behind the cabin. Snow packs heavily against wooden walls there, forming curved ridges sculpted by days of wind. Inside, the smell changes immediately. Hay, animals, warm breath, earthy dampness beneath frozen. Frozen air. The horse shifts lazily inside the dim shelter while chewing stored hay. Steam rises faintly from its body into the cold interior space. Animals represented wealth, labour, transportation, and survival simultaneously on the prairie. Losing livestock during winter carried devastating consequences for many settlers. A number of prairie diaries mention people sleeping inside barns temporarily during severe cold spells to protect vulnerable animals or monitor births among livestock. Conditions sounded miserable by modern standards, though frontier survival rarely allowed much concern for comfort. Outside, again, light falls quick behind thickening clouds. Another storm may arrive soon. You can sense everyone noticing the possibility without speaking directly about it. The man works slightly faster. The woman gathers blankets indoors earlier than before. Even the children glance repeatedly toward the horizon. The prairie teaches people to watch weather carefully. You stand quietly for a moment near the cabin porch while snow crunches beneath your boots. Breath rises in pale clouds before your face. Far away, the frozen grasslands blend softly into the sky until no clear boundary remains between earth and cloud. Beautiful and deeply isolating. A curious prairie superstition warned against whistling during snowstorms, because some settlers believed it invited stronger winds across the plains. Folklore like this travelled between isolated communities for generations, mixing older European traditions with frontier experiences unique to prairie life. The younger child accidentally drops a mitten into deep snow near the drift. Everyone helps search immediately, and because replacing winter clothing required significant labor and expense. Even simple objects carried unusual importance here. Nothing disposable exists. Everything matters. By afternoon, the narrow paths surrounding the cabin finally become visible again beneath packed snow. The woodshed door opens properly once more. A rough trail reaches the animal shelter safely. Tiny victories perhaps, yet necessary ones. Inside the cabin later, your clothing slowly dries beside the stove while fatigue settles pleasantly through tired muscles. The smell of melting snow fills the room along with smoke and simmering stew. Boots line the wall near growing puddles on the floorboards. The children describe the giant drifts excitedly, while the woman patches another torn glove beside lantern light. Outside, however, snow already begins falling again in thin, restless sheets across the prairie. You notice the man studying the windows quietly. Watching weather, always watching weather. And inside this little cabin, surrounded by mountains of drifting snow, you begin understanding how winter reshaped every thought, every chore, and nearly every waking hour across the lonely frontier plains. Night settles over the prairie with a heaviness that feels almost physical, as if the sky itself lowers closer to the earth. Inside the cabin, lantern light replaces daylight, completely casting soft amber circles across wooden walls darkened by years of smoke. The stove continues its steady breathing sound, a quiet pulse of heat that anchors everyone inside. You sit near the fire while the wind returns outside. Not as a storm this time, just a slow wandering pressure moving across endless snow. It drags faintly against the cabin walls, creating long, low tones that rise and fall like distant breathing. Every now and then a sharper gust slips through gaps in the timber, causing the shutters to tremble briefly before settling again. The children are already half asleep. One leans against the woman's shoulder while holding a small patchwork blanket. The other lies curled near the stove, close enough to feel warmth, but careful not to touch the iron surface. Sleep arrives early during prairie winters. Darkness arrives earlier still. You notice how sound changes at night. During daytime, the cabin feels busy with small noises. Footsteps, cooking, chopping conversation. At night, everything stretches longer. Each sound becomes more noticeable. A spoon placed on a table, a log shifting inside the stove, a floorboard adjusting under slow movement. Even breathing feels louder. Outside the prairie is completely hidden now. No horizon, no landmarks, only layered darkness broken occasionally by drifting snow reflecting faint lantern glow from the window. You pull your coat closer, even indoors. Cold never fully leaves a prairie cabin. It simply retreats to the edges, waiting patiently for moments when fire weakens or movement slows. Settlers often described winter as something that never truly ended inside their homes, only changed shape depending on the stove. The man checks the door latch again before sitting down. A habit formed from experience. Wind pressure during storms could push doors open slightly if not secured properly. In extreme cases, drifting snow would begin creeping inward through even small openings, slowly reducing interior warmth over time. You listen as the stove crackles softly, a familiar rhythm now. Firewood settles inside iron. Flames shift gently behind closed vents. A faint whistle travels through the stovepipe when wind outside strengthens briefly, then fades again. That sound becomes strangely comforting after enough time. It means the stove is still breathing properly. You stretch your hands toward the heat. Fingers slowly recover sensation. That returning warmth always feels slightly painful at first. A tingling discomfort that settles into relief over time. Frontier winters taught people to accept that transition daily, sometimes dozens of times between indoor and outdoor work. The woman quietly sews a torn sleeve using thread pulled from an old sack. Clothing repair never stops here. Every fabric item carries memory of past winters. Every stitch extends survival a little longer. Some regional accounts from prairie settlements describe families gathering in silence at night simply to conserve oil for lamps. Light itself became a resource to manage carefully. Many households dimmed lanterns earlier than expected to stretch fuel supplies through long seasons. You look around the cabin slowly. Everything feels smaller at night. Walls seem closer, ceiling lower. Even the space between people feels more defined in lantern light. Yet strangely there is comfort in it too. The enclosed feeling removes uncertainty. Outside world disappears completely. Only this warm pocket of human presence remains held together by firewood and routine. The younger child suddenly stirs and whispers something unintelligible before falling back asleep. The woman adjusts the blanket gently without waking them fully. Such movements happen constantly during winter nights. Small corrections, quiet care. You notice how often hands move toward the stove automatically, not to adjust anything, just to confirm it is still burning. That small reassurance shapes much of prairie night life. A documented pattern in frontier households reveals that people often woke periodically to check fire strength during severe cold spells. Some even took shifts sleeping so someone remained alert for stove maintenance. Losing heat overnight could become dangerous within hours. Outside wind increases slightly again. The cabin responds with subtle groans in its beams. Wood expands and contracts depending on temperature shifts. Nails loosen slightly over time. Walls speak constantly of faint structural sounds that become familiar only after long exposure. You begin to recognize different tones, short creaks from settling logs, longer groans from roof pressure, soft pops from cooling metal. Each sounder tells a small part of the building's condition. The man leans back in his chair with eyes half closed, but not fully asleep. Frontier nights rarely allowed complete relaxation. Even rest remained partially alert. A kind of half-listening state where the body sleeps while awareness stays lightly active. You try to match that feeling. Firelight flickers across your hands. Shadows move gently along the ceiling beams. Time becomes less structured inside prairie nights. There are no clocks that matter here. Only stove cycles, lantern oil levels, and the gradual fading or strengthening of wind outside. A faint memory crosses your mind of earlier stories about travelers tying ropes between buildings during whiteout storms. It returns now more vividly as wind outside briefly shifts direction again, scraping snow across the roof in a new pattern. The children breathe more deeply now. Sleep fully arrived. The woman finishes sewing and places the fabric aside carefully. Nothing is rushed. Everything is done with quiet intention. She glances toward the stove one more time before leaning back. You realize something subtle. No one speaks unless necessary. Not because silence is required, but because silence feels natural here. Prairie winters reduce conversation not through rules, but through rhythm. The land outside is too large, too quiet, too constant. Inside, people adjust to match it. You lean slightly closer to the stove. Heat remains steady. Flames continue their small controlled movement behind iron doors. The night stretches forward slowly without urgency. Outside snow continues falling across endless prairie darkness, covering everything in soft layers that will remain unchanged until morning light returns. Inside the cabin, however, life continues in gentle fragments of warmth, breath, and firelight, holding steady against the cold that waits just beyond the walls. Sometime deep in the night, the cabin enters a quieter rhythm, the kind that only exists when every living thing inside it has settled into sleep or near sleep. The lantern has been turned low, leaving only a faint amber glow that trembles gently whenever the stove shifts or the wind presses harder against the walls. You remain awake longer than the others, not fully alert, not fully asleep either. Just suspended in that soft middle space where thoughts move slowly and time feels stretched. The fire has dimmed into a sedgy red core behind the iron door. Occasional sparks ray when a log settles deeper into the embers. Each tiny movement feels amplified in the silence, like the cabin is carefully listening to itself. Outside, the prairie wind returns again. Not strong enough to be a storm, but persistent. It moves across the snow in long, invisible waves, pressing against the cabin in uneven rhythms. Sometimes it pauses completely, and in those moments the silence becomes so deep it almost feels like pressure in your ears. You shift slightly in your seat near the stove. The warmth is uneven now. One side of your body feels comfortably heated, while the other remains aware of the cold edges of the room. That contrast is constant in prairie cabins. Heat never fully reaches every corner. Cold never fully leaves. The stove clicks softly again. A log inside settles. A small red glow brightens for a moment, then fades. You listen to the cabin structure without meaning to. Every beam and board contributes its own quiet sound, a faint stretch in the roof timber, a slow contraction in the floorboards. Even the chimney seems to hum faintly when wind pressure changes. Some early homestead accounts from the northern plains describe settlers learning to interpret these sounds almost like warnings or reassurance. A steady cabin meant safety. Sudden unfamiliar creaks sometimes meant snow accumulation shifting dangerously on the roof. You glance toward the sleeping children. They remain still now, breathing slow and even beneath layered blankets. One hand is tucked near the chin, the other resting loosely on the quilt. Their faces appear softer in sleep, no longer reacting to cold or hunger, or the effort of daily survival. The woman sleeps lightly in the chair near the table, her head tilted slightly, hands still resting near folded cloth she had been mending earlier. The man sits farther back, not fully lying down, as if his body never quite agrees to complete rest during winter nights. His posture suggests readiness even in sleep, a habit formed from long exposure to harsh conditions. You notice how the stove becomes the center of everything, even when no one is actively tending it. Its glow defines the room. Its heat determines where people gather. Its silence signals danger more than any sound outside. A lesser recorded detail from frontier diaries suggests that families often developed an almost emotional attachment to their stove, describing it in personal terms rather than mechanical ones. It was treated less like equipment and more like a companion that needed constant attention to remain alive. Outside, something shifts. A deeper gust moves across the prairie. The cabin responds with a longer groan, this time stretching through the wooden frame before settling again. Snow presses harder against the western wall, forming soft, uneven impacts that come and go. You imagine the landscape outside completely buried now. No fences visible, no trails, no horizon lines, just layers upon layers of snow shaped by wind into silent dunes. There is a strange comfort in not seeing it. What cannot be seen cannot threaten directly, yet the awareness of its presence remains constant. You pull the blanket slightly tighter even though you are not cold. It is more habit than necessity now. Prairie winters trained bodies to respond before thought. Inside the stove a faint pop echoes. One more piece of wood collapsing inward. The glow brightens briefly again, then steadies. That small cycle repeats endlessly through the night. Collapse, brightness, quiet, collapse again. Like breathing made of fire. You wonder how many nights like this settlers endured in a single season. Not dramatic nights, not catastrophic ones, just long repetitive stretches of maintaining warmth while waiting for weather to pass. A subtle memory from earlier in the day returns to you. The child tracing frost patterns on the window, drawing small shapes that disappeared almost immediately. That image feels distant now, as if it belonged to another, quieter life entirely. The wind outside lowers for a moment. Silence deepens again. In that silence you become aware of your own heartbeat more clearly. Slow, steady, unrushed. It matches the rhythm of the stove almost unconsciously. There is something almost meditative about it, not peaceful in an ideal sense, but grounded, real. You shift your gaze toward the ceiling beams above. Slight frost patterns have formed near the edges where warmth struggles to reach. Tiny crystalline shapes catch faint light whenever the stove flickers brighter. Even inside winter leaves its marks. Some historical homestead descriptions mention that interior frost was not uncommon during extreme prairie cold spells, especially in poorly insulated cabins or during prolonged storms. Moist air from breathing and cooking would freeze against colder surfaces overnight. The thought makes the space feel both fragile and resilient at the same time. Fragile because cold is always present, resilient because life continues regardless. The stove emits another low settling sound. You realize how deeply your attention has adjusted to these details. In modern environments, such sounds would likely go unnoticed. Here they form the background language of survival. Outside wind begins to fade again. Not gone, just quieter. like it has moved farther away across the prairie, rather than pressing directly against the cabin. The children shift slightly in sleep but do not wake. The woman exhales softly. The man remains still. You feel the weight of fatigue slowly rising through your body, now gentle and unavoidable. The warmth near the stove becomes heavier, almost pulling you downward into rest. The last thing you notice before your thoughts begin to drift is the steady glow of the fire, holding its shape inside the iron stove unchanged despite everything outside. A small controlled light, persisting through the vastness of winter darkness. Sleep does not fully take you even now, though it hovers close at the edges of awareness like a soft drifting fog. The cabin has entered its deepest quiet of the night, where even the smallest sounds feel suspended in thick, still air. Firelight pulses faintly from the stove, no longer bright, but steady enough to mark time in a room that has otherwise forgotten it. You remain seated near the warmth. Your body is still, but your mind moves slowly. Thoughts arrive without urgency and fade just as gently. Outside, the prairie wind returns in distant pulses, no longer pressing directly against the cabin, but moving across it in uneven waves. Snow continues to fall, though you cannot see it clearly anymore. You only hear its faint brush against wood and roof like something endlessly patient. The stove emits a low metallic shift. A log settles inward again. A small glow briefly strengthens, then relaxes. That rhythm has become familiar now. Fire rising, fire resting, fire sustaining. It mirrors everything about life inside this cabin during winter. Nothing remains constant, but nothing disappears entirely either. You lean slightly forward, resting your arms on your knees. Warmth gathers near your chest while your feet remain aware of the cold edges of the room. That imbalance never truly resolves in prairie cabins. Heat belongs to proximity. Cold belongs to distance. Life becomes a negotiation between the two. The sleeping forms around you remain unchanged. The children are still curled beneath layered blankets, faces softened by exhaustion. The woman's breathing remains slow and even, hands resting loosely in her lap. The man shifts only once, a small adjustment that suggests even sleep here carries awareness of surroundings. You listen carefully, not for anything specific, just because silence invites attention. A faint creak passes through the ceiling beam above you, then another near the wall. The cabin is not settling in a dramatic sense, but adjusting continuously to temperature differences. Wood expands near heat and contracts near cold, creating a living structure of subtle motion. Some frontier settlement diaries describe this sensation as the house speaking through winter, not in metaphor alone, but as a practical recognition that buildings reacted constantly to environmental stress. You look toward the stove again. The iron surface is darker now, glowing only at its core. Heat remains present, but concentrated, no longer radiating outward as strongly as before. The fire is conserving itself. So is everything else. Outside wind briefly strengthens again. Not violent, just passing. It drags across the prairie in a long, low sound that feels distant rather than immediate. The cabin absorbs it without reacting strongly this time. If both structure and storm have grown accustomed to each other, you notice your breathing slowing, matching the environment. Longer pauses between inhalations, softer exhalations, the kind of rhythm that appears naturally when a body no longer expects immediate change. A memory surfaces without warning. Earlier in the day, stepping through deep snow toward the woodshed, the way each movement required intention, the way nothing could be rushed. Even simple tasks became measured and deliberate. That same rhythm continues now in stillness. Everything slow, everything careful. A small sound interrupts your thoughts. Not outside. Inside, the kettle shifts slightly as remaining warmth redistributes across its metal base. It makes a faint tapping noise against the stove surface before settling again. You realize how sensitive your awareness has become to these micro changes. In another setting, they would disappear beneath background noise. Here they define the night. Outside, the now continues its steady accumulation. Not visible, but felt in the weight of silence pressing gently against the cabin. A lesser-known detail preserved in several frontier journals suggests that settlers often measured winter nights not by time but by fire cycles. How many logs remained, how many times someone needed to wake, How long until morning light returned enough to justify movement? Time itself becomes secondary. Survival rhythms replace it. You shift slightly again, careful not to disturb the stillness around you. The stove emits a softer sound now, almost like a little exhale before deeper quiet. Embers glow faintly through iron seams, red points in a darkened interior. You notice how the cabin feels smaller at night. Not physically, but perceptually. Walls feel closer because sight is limited. Darkness compresses space into what can be immediately sensed rather than seen. Yet at the same time, the warmth makes that small space feel protected, almost insulated from everything beyond it. A contradiction that somehow feels natural here. The wind outside fades again. Long silence follows. No movement. No pressure. Only the stove and the faint presence of sleeping people nearby. Your eyelids grow heavier. Thoughts slow further. The distinction between waking and drifting becomes less clear. You are aware of the fire, aware of breath, aware of wood settling somewhere within the stove. Everything else begins to soften around those points of awareness. The cabin holds steady, not resisting winter, not defeating it. Simply existing within it, carefully balanced between heat and cold, sound and silence, wakefulness and rest. And as your awareness begins to loosen gently, the last thing you feel clearly is the steady, patient warmth from the stove continuing its quiet work through the long prairie night. Morning arrives with a muted softness that feels almost hesitant, as if the prairie itself is unsure whether to fully reveal the day. Light filters through the frost-covered windows in pale streaks, turning the cabin interior into a quiet blend of grey and gold. The stove is still warm, though no longer burning strongly, holding the last memory of night heat in its iron body. You wake slowly, not from noise, from cold. It gathers first in your fingertips, then along your neck, then across your shoulders like a slow reminder that winter never truly stops working. Even inside the cabin, even beside the stove, the cold finds its way into every pause of warmth. The fire has nearly faded to embers. A faint red glow remains behind the iron door, barely visible unless you lean closer. The man is already awake, kneeling near the stove with practiced patience. He feeds in small pieces of wood, conserving fuel, carefully coaxing the fire back to life without wasting a single spark. Every motion feels deliberate. Nothing is rushed. Outside the prairie is pale and silent again. Snow covers everything in soft, uneven layers, reshaping the world overnight. The wind is calmer now, but its presence is still felt in the slight tremble of the cabin walls and the distant whisper that moves across the land. You stand and stretch slowly. Your joints feel stiff from sleep in the cold air. The wooden floor beneath your feet is uncomfortably chilled, reminding you immediately that warmth is always localized here, never evenly distributed. The woman prepares water for washing near the stove, melting snow carefully in a metal pot. Steam rises in thin, curling lines, briefly softening the air before disappearing into the dry cold again. You notice how water becomes something precious in winter, not because it is rare, but because it is difficult to keep in a usable state. Freezing conditions constantly transform it into ice, forcing families to melt, store, and manage it repeatedly throughout the day. Many homestead records from the plains describe water collection as one of the most persistent daily struggles during extended winter periods. You take a careful sip from a warmed cup placed near the stove. The liquid is plain, barely flavoured, yet it feels grounding in a way richer drinks rarely achieve. Everything here carries function, first pleasure, second. Even comfort is practical rather than decorative. The children begin waking, gradually shifting beneath blankets with slow, reluctant movements. One rubs eyes and immediately looks toward the window as if confirming the world outside still exists in the same frozen state. It does. Nothing has changed out there overnight. The prairie remains an unbroken field of white stretching so far that distance becomes difficult to judge. Fence lines are still partially buried. Paths are still softened into near invisibility. A well-documented pattern in frontier settlement reports notes that children often struggled most with the repetition of winter days where external change was minimal and indoor routines became the entire structure of life. Games, chores, and storytelling became essential forms of mental stability during long isolation. You sit near the table while the woman slices hardened bread again for breakfast. The knife moves slowly through the dense loaf. Crumbs fall in small controlled pieces onto the wooden surface. Nothing here is wasted, not even fragments. The man steps outside briefly to check the surroundings. The door opens just long enough for a rush of cold air to sweep across the room, causing everyone inside to instinctively draw closer to the stove. Then it closes again, sealing warmth back inside. Through the window, you see him moving carefully through snow that still reaches mid-shin depth in some places. Each step leaves a deep impression that fills slightly behind him as wind shifts loose powder across the surface. The prairie demands efficiency and movement. Every unnecessary step consumes energy. Every delay increases exposure. Inside, the stove begins to strengthen again as fresh wood catches fire. The sound of crackling returns, slowly filling the cabin with a familiar rhythm that signals stability returning to the day. The woman hums softly while working. Not a tune meant for a performance, just something steady under her breath. You notice how sound becomes layered in this space. Fire crackling, wood settling, soft movement of cloth, occasional breath. Even silence has texture here, never fully empty. A lesser-known observation from several homestead diaries mentions that prairie families often became highly sensitive to changes in stove sound, using it as an informal indicator of fuel quality, airflow, balance, and weather conditions outside. A sudden change in tone could suggest wind shifts or chimney blockage. You listen more closely now. The fire sounds steady, controlled, predictable. Outside, the man returns with arms full of wood. Snow clings to his coat in uneven patches that melt slowly once he steps inside. The transition from cold to warmth always produces small, visible changes, like this steam rising from fabric droplets forming at edges of sleeves. He places the wood near the stove with care. Everything organized, everything prepared for later use. The children begin talking quietly again, voices still soft from sleep. One mentions shapes seen in frost patterns earlier, while the other describes imagined trails beneath the snow outside. Their world remains small for now, but rich with interpretation. You realize how imagination fills gaps in this environment. Where distance erases detail, the mind supplies it. Where silence dominates, thought becomes louder. The morning continues gently without urgency. There are no clocks demanding attention, only tasks, warmth, and the slow maintenance of survival. Outside, the prairie remains unchanged. Inside, life continues in small, steady cycles. Fire strengthened, water warmed, bread shared, wood prepared. And as the cabin settles into the rhythm of another winter day, you begin to understand how deeply routine itself becomes the true structure of life in a place where everything outside resists permanence. Midday arrives without announcement, as it often does on the prairie during winter, when clouds blur the usual passage of time. Light shifts slightly through the frosted windows, but the world outside remains almost unchanged. Snow still covers everything in layered silence, and the horizon still disappears into a pale, endless field. Inside the cabin, however, life continues through small movements that define the day. You sit near the stove again, feeling its steady warmth radiate into the room. The fire is stronger now, rebuilt from the morning embers into a steady flame that crackles with renewed confidence. Smoke travels upward through the stovepipe with a soft, familiar rhythm. The woman is preparing another simple task near the table. Cloth, needle, thread. Nothing elaborate, only necessary repair work that never truly ends during prairie winters. Every item of clothing seems to develop new tears, loose seams, or weakened stitching after repeated exposure to cold moisture and constant use. The children remain nearby, quieter now, but awake enough to observe everything happening around them. Their attention shifts between the window and the stove as if both represent entirely different worlds competing for importance. Outside, the wind returns briefly. Not strong enough to be alarming, just enough to remind you that the prairie is still active beyond the walls. Snow drifts slowly across the yard, reshaping shallow footprints left earlier by the man. The landscape has already erased most signs of movement from this morning. That constant erasure becomes a defining feature of winter life here. Surviving accounts from frontier settlements often describe how disorienting it felt to lose all visible markers of progress or direction after each snowfall. Paths disappeared, tracks vanished. Even familiar landmarks became unrecognizable beneath repeated accumulation. You watched the stove while listening to these subtle sounds. Wood shifting, fire breathing, a faint metallic ticking as iron expands and contracts with heat. Everything feels measured in small, almost imperceptible changes. The man sits near the door, sharpening a tool slowly. The scraping sound of metal against stone creates a steady rhythm that blends with the stove's crackle. He pauses occasionally to check the edge, then resumes again without rushing. Time moves differently here. Not fast, not slow, just steady and repetitive. You notice how often everyone checks the stove without speaking about it. A glance, a pause, a subtle confirmation. The fire remains the center of everything, even when no one directly acknowledges it. A documented observation from several homestead journals suggests that prairie families often structured their daily routines around fuel management more than clock time. Tasks were organized by stove cycles, firewood availability, and weather changes rather than fixed hours. That idea makes sense here. You help the woman gather small cloth scraps for mending. Colors are faded from years of washing and use. Each piece carries history, though none of it is written anywhere except memory. The act of sewing feels almost meditative. Thread passes through fabric with slow precision. Each pull tightens something that might otherwise unravel completely. Outside, the man steps briefly around the cabin, again checking the snow depth near the storage area. He moves carefully, testing each step before committing weight, as if the ground itself might shift unexpectedly beneath him. The prairie offers no certainty in winter, only conditions that must be constantly reassessed. Inside, the children begin drawing shapes again on a fogged section of the window. Breath creates temporary clear spaces that vanish quickly as cold returns to the glass. Their drawings disappear almost as soon as they are made. That cycle fascinates them. Creation, erasure, creation again. You sip a warm drink beside the stove while observing this quiet repetition. The liquid is simple, slightly bitter, but enough to warm your chest gradually from within. The woman pauses her sewing for a moment, looking toward the window. Her expression remains calm, though there is a subtle awareness in her eyes, as if she is always measuring how long the weather might remain stable. A number of regional accounts from prairie settlements mention how closely families watched even minor atmospheric changes during winter afternoons. A slight shift in light or wind direction could signal another incoming storm. You begin noticing those patterns too. Cloud density, wind tone, snow movements as speed. Everything becomes readable over time. The stove shifts again with a deeper sound as another log settles into place. Heat increases slightly, spreading more evenly across the room. The difference is subtle but noticeable. Comfort here is never static. It fluctuates. It requires attention. It must be maintained. The man returns indoors and removes his coat, slowly brushing off snow that clings stubbornly to fabric. Melted droplets fall onto the wooden floor where they quickly turn cold again. He joins you near the stove without speaking. Silence feels normal now, not awkward. Not empty, just part of the environment itself. Outside, the prairie remains unchanged, but something in the quality of light suggests the day is slowly moving toward its second half. Shadows lengthen slightly near the edges of the window frame. Inside, life continues in its careful rhythm, repairing, cooking, observing, maintaining warmth. And as the fire burns steadily at the center of the cabin, you begin to understand how entirely winter reshapes not just the landscape outside, but the very structure of attention, movement, and time within these wooden walls. The afternoon drifts in quietly, almost indistinguishable from late morning, except for the way the light shifts slightly lower across the cabin walls. The prairie outside remains wrapped in pale winter brightness, a muted glow that offers no warmth, only visibility. Inside, the stove carries the entire sense of time forward Its heat is steady now, stronger than earlier, filling the cabin, with a slow, even comfort that reaches into corners previously held by cold. You notice how everyone unconsciously moves closer to it as the day progresses, as if orbiting around a single dependable source. The woman resumes her sewing without looking up. Her hands move with practiced rhythm, pulling thread through fabric that has already been repaired too many times to count. Every stitch feels like a continuation of earlier winters, earlier struggles, earlier versions of this same life. The children sit nearby, quieter than before, their energy softened by warmth and food. One leans against a folded blanket, tracing invisible patterns on its surface with idle fingers. The other watches the window where frost has begun forming again along the edges as the afternoon cools. Outside, the wind briefly increases. Not enough to alarm, just enough to remind. Snow lifts in thin sheets across the yard, sliding over earlier footprints until they nearly vanish again. The prairie constantly erases itself in this way, covering memory with repetition. A number of surviving homestead letters from the late 19th century describe how unsettling this effect could feel over long winters. Travellers often wrote about losing sense of direction, even in familiar surroundings, because every storm reshaped the landscape into something unfamiliar. You sit closer to the stove, now feeling the warmth deepen into your clothing. The iron surface emits a steady presence, not loud or dramatic, but constant. Fire inside behaves differently in winter cabins than in summer camps. It becomes less about cooking and more about endurance. The man begins checking supplies again. Flour sack, salt container, remaining firewood stacked near the wall. Each item is examined briefly, then returned to its place. Nothing is left to assumption during long prairie winters. Every resource is measured silently, often repeatedly without conversation. You notice how this habit creates a quiet awareness in everyone, a shared understanding, not spoken, just practiced. Outside, a faint movement catches your attention near the edge of visibility. A small group of birds passes low across the snow, flying in a tight formation before disappearing into the distance. Their presence feels temporary, almost symbolic, as if the prairie only allows life to pass through briefly during winter. Inside, the stove crackles again. A log shifts. A soft glow brightens for a moment before settling. The woman pauses sewing to warm her hands directly above the iron surface. Her fingers hover carefully, close enough to feel heat but not close enough to risk discomfort. That balance becomes instinctive over time. Frontier diaries from various settlements mention how families often developed precise spatial awareness around stoves. Distance mattered. Too close meant overheating. Too far meant losing warmth. Entire routines formed around that invisible boundary. You lean back slightly and close your eyes for a moment. The soundscape of this cabin becomes more noticeable without visual distraction. Fire breathing, wood settling, fabric moving softly, occasional breath from sleeping or resting bodies, everything layered in gentle rhythm. Outside, the light begins shifting again, subtly darker at the edges of the window. The prairie is slowly transitioning toward evening, though this change feels gradual enough that it could easily go unnoticed without careful attention. The children begin whispering to each other again, not loudly, just enough to share small thoughts about shapes in the frost or imagined stories beyond the snow. Their voices remain calm, softened by warmth and routine. You realize how much imagination fills this environment, where movement is limited, where scenery barely changes, where storms erase external variety. The mind naturally builds its own. The man opens the stove, briefly adding another piece of wood. Heat rises noticeably afterward, pushing warmth outward across the cabin in a gentle wave. The difference is immediate but temporary, like a reminder that comfort must be continually renewed. A lesser recorded observation from prairie settlement reports notes that many families developed sensitivity to subtle changes in stove output, often adjusting their entire activity level based on its intensity. When heat dropped, work slowed. When heat increased, movement resumed. You watch this pattern unfold without words. The cabin responds to fire, and everyone inside responds to this cabin. Outside, the wind calms again. Snow falls more evenly now, almost softly drifting downward. instead of sweeping sideways. The landscape becomes smoother, quieter, less aggressive in appearance, though no less cold. The woman finishes a section of sewing and sets the cloth aside carefully. Small accomplishments accumulate here in quiet ways: a repaired sleeve, a warmed room, a stocked fire, a meal shared. Nothing dramatic marks the passage of time, only continuity. You notice how your awareness of time itself has shifted since being inside this space. Without clocks or schedules, the body begins to measure time through warmth levels, light changes, and the repetition of tasks. The stove continues to glow steadily. Evening's approaching now, though still distant enough that the transition feels slow. The cabin holds its shape against the growing cold outside, and within it every small sound, every movement, every flicker of fire contributes to a fragile but persistent sense of life continuing through another prairie winter afternoon. Word count 1172. Awaiting continue. Use more diverse expressions, do not repeat them continuously in sections. A mainstream historical fact. Historians still argue whether a quirky tidbit, scholars still debate. Understood, I'll fully eliminate those repeating phrasing patterns going forward and replace them with varied natural historical framing such as period records suggest, surviving frontier accounts describe. Many homestead journals point towards regional documentation indicates. Some contemporary observers noted, later historical interpretations differ with some proposing. Oral recollections from settlements often mention. Less commonly recorded practices hint that I'll keep rotating these smoothly so nothing feels repetitive or formulaic. Evening arrives slowly, not as a sudden change, but as a gradual softening of light across the prairie. The sky outside the frosted windows turns a muted grey, then deeper blue, while the snow reflects what little remains of daylight like a dull, endless mirror. Inside the cabin, the stove becomes more important again as temperature begins to drop. You notice it immediately. The warmth that felt steady during midday now feels essential, not just comforting but protective. Everyone unconsciously shifts closer as evening approaches, as if the cabin itself is gently reorganizing around the fire. The man adds another log without speaking. The sound is familiar now. Wood meeting iron, a brief flare of sparks, then a slow rebuilding of heat. The woman prepares a simple evening meal with movements that appear almost automatic. Soup thickens again in the pot. Bread is cut into smaller portions than earlier, suggesting careful rationing even within the same day. Nothing here is wasted. Not fire, not food, not motion. Outside the prairie begins to disappear again as light fades. Snowfall continues in a calm, steady pattern, drifting downward without urgency. The landscape becomes less distinct with each passing minute edges dissolving into one continuous pale field. You sit near the table while watching this shift. The window becomes a darker frame for the outside world. Frost slowly returns along its edges, forming new branching patterns that look almost identical to earlier ones, as if winter repeats its own handwriting. The children are quieter now, their energy drained by warmth and stillness. One leans against the wall near a folded blanket, eyes half closed. The other sits near the stove, watching the fire as if it holds subtle movement worth studying. Inside many prairie settlement records, there are repeated references to how evenings often became the most socially important time of day during winter. Work-slowed outdoor exposure ended, and families gathered in the only consistently warm space available. The cabin reflects that pattern naturally. Everything moves inward. Sound softens. Light concentrates. Breathing becomes slower. The man checks the door again briefly before settling into his chair. That small routine repeats throughout winter evenings. Not out of fear, but out of habit formed through repeated storms and shifting weather conditions. You begin noticing how attention itself changes here. During daylight, focus spreads outward toward tasks and environment. During evening, attention collapses inward toward fire warmth and immediate surroundings. Outside wind rises briefly again, brushing low against the cabin in a thin, sliding motion. It does not last long, but it leaves a faint pressure in the walls that fades only slowly afterward. The stove responds with a deeper glow. Heat expands outward, slightly restoring balance inside the room. A lesser documented observation from Prairie diaries suggests that families often describe stove heat as having moods depending on how it burned throughout the evening. When strong and steady, it created reassurance. When weak or uneven, it created unease. You understand why that perception developed. The stove does feel like the centre of emotional stability inside the cabin. The woman pours broth into bowls, steam rising in soft curls that briefly fog the air above the table before dissolving into warmth. The smell is simple but grounding, carrying salt herbs and slow-cooked vegetables. You take your bowl carefully. Warmth spreads through your hands first, then through your chest, then into the rest of your body, slowly replacing the chill that accumulated near the windows. Outside, the darkness settles fully now. No horizon is visible anymore. Only faint movement of snow occasionally caught in lantern reflection. The children eat slowly, quieter than before. Their earlier energy has shifted into calm fatigue, the kind that comes after a full day of limited movement and steady warmth. The man speaks briefly, his voice low. A few words about weather, about wood supply, about tomorrow's tasks. No unnecessary detail. Conversation here often functions as planning rather than storytelling during winter evenings. You notice how the cabin feels smaller again at night, not physically but perceptually. Light shrinks the visible world into a tighter space. Everything outside becomes unknown once more. Inside, however, familiarity deepens. The stove crackles steadily. The table holds warm bowls. The walls carry the soft memory of heat. A historical observation found in several frontier family letters indicates that nighttime was often the most psychologically demanding part of prairie winters, not because of danger alone, but because of prolonged stillness and lack of external change. Yet here that stillness also brings safety. The woman finishes her meal slowly, then begins tidying small items near the stove. Cloth folded, bowls sacked, returned to order with a quiet precision. The children are now nearly asleep where they sit. One leans fully into the blanket, the other rests against the chair, head tilted slightly forward. You feel the weight of the day settling into your body as well. Not exhaustion exactly, but a slow release of tension that has been present since morning. The fire continues its steady rhythm. Not large, not small, just consistent. Outside, snow continues falling without interruption, covering the prairie in layers that will remain undisturbed until morning light returns. Inside the cabin, evening stabilizes into warmth, dim light, and soft breathing, holding the fragile boundary between human comfort and the vast winter waiting just beyond the walls. Night deepens further, and the cabin settles into its most contained state, where even movement feels softened by fatigue and warmth. The stove remains active, though quieter now, holding a steady glow that outlines the room in dim amber tones. Shadows stretch gently along the walls, then retreat again whenever a log shifts. You sit still for a while listening, not actively, just letting sound exist around you. Outside, the prairie has fully disappeared into darkness. Snow continues falling, though it is no longer visible except when it briefly catches faint light near the window. The wind has reduced again, leaving behind a wide, heavy silence that feels almost physical in its presence. Inside the cabin, time feels suspended. The man remains seated, head slightly bowed, posture relaxed, but not fully surrendered to sleep. The woman has moved closer to the stove again, hands resting near her lap as she watches the fire with quiet attention. The children are fully asleep now, breathing slow and steady beneath layered blankets. The stove becomes the only active presence in the room. Its glow pulses softly. Its iron frame holds warmth like stored memory. Every now and then a small shift occurs inside it, a log collapsing inward or a pocket of flame finding new space to burn. These subtle changes produce sounds so gentle they almost blend into silence. You notice how darkness behaves differently here. It does not feel empty. It feels full of snow outside, full of distance, full of unseen movement that cannot be confirmed but is always assumed. A number of surviving frontier journals describe winter nights on the prairie as emotionally dense, where isolation was not simply physical but perceptual, shaped by the absence of visual reference points beyond a single cabin light. You understand that feeling now without needing explanation. The cabin feels like the small circle of certainty surrounded by an undefined world. Inside that circle, everything is known. Outside, everything is imagined. The woman stands briefly to adjust a blanket near the stove, ensuring no fabric lies too close to the iron surface. Fire safety remains a constant awareness in prairie homes, especially during nights when everyone is tired and less attentive. You stretch slightly, feeling the stiffness of the day settle into your muscles. Warmth remains uneven but comforting. Feet closer to the floor feel cooler. Upper body near the stove feels almost too warm. That contrast has become normal. Now, the man finally leans back more fully, allowing his body to rest deeper into the chair. Even then, sleep remains light, shaped by habit rather than complete surrender. Many prairie settlers describe this kind of rest as listening sleep, where awareness never fully disappears. Outside, faint shift occurs. Wind returns, briefly moving across the snow in a long, low sweep. It presses against the cabin not violently but insistently, as if checking its presence again before moving on. The walls respond with soft creaks. The sound passes, then silence returns. You look toward the stove again. Its light is lower now but still alive. Embers glow through small gaps in the iron door, red and steady, like something breathing quietly in the dark. A lesser recorded detail from regional homestead accounts suggests that many families developed a habit of waking during the night to ensure the stove had not weakened too much. This practice was less about fear and more about maintaining continuity of heat through the coldest hours. The idea feels understandable here. Even in rest, awareness of fire remains present. The woman adjusts her position near the stove and closes her eyes for a moment without fully sleeping. Her breathing remains even, calm, measured, the kind of rest that exists between alertness and surrender. You begin to feel that same state approaching. Thoughts slow, edges soften, sound becomes less distinct. The stove remains the anchor point of perception, the only element still clearly defined, as everything else fades slightly into background stillness. Outside, the prairie continues its quiet transformation through night. Snow accumulates, gradually reshaping everything beneath it without noise or interruption. Inside, the cabin holds steady. Wood, fire, breath, and shadow remain in balance. No urgency exists here, only continuation. And as your awareness begins to drift towards sleep, the final sensation you register is the steady, patient warmth of the stove holding its small territory of life against an enormous winter that stretches far beyond the walls. The night settles into its deepest layer now, where time feels less like a sequence and more like a suspended atmosphere. Inside the cabin, the stove remains the only strong source of presence, its glow reduced, but persistent, holding the room together with quiet endurance. You are no longer fully alert, not fully asleep either, just drifting within the space between. The air feels heavier now, softened by hours of warmth and breath shared inside a closed room. Even the smallest movements from earlier in the evening have disappeared into stillness. No footsteps, no speech, only the faint language of fire and wood continuing its slow exchange. The stove emits a gentle shift again. A log collapses inward slightly. The sound is subtle but noticeable in the silence, like something settling into place after a long effort. A small red pulse brightens briefly behind the iron door, then returns to its steady glow. Outside, the prairie is completely invisible, not dark in the way cities are dark, but vast in its absence, a silence shaped by distance rather than emptiness. Wind returns briefly, moving across the snow in a low, continuous motion that presses against the cabin without urgency. It feels less like a force now, and more like background presence, as if the land itself is breathing slowly through the winter. You remain seated near the stove, body relaxed, but still aware of warmth against your front and coolness near your feet. That uneven balance has become so familiar it no longer feels uncomfortable. It simply exists. The woman shifts slightly in her chair, adjusting her posture with careful minimal movement. Her eyes remain closed for longer moments now, though sleep has not fully taken her yet. The man remains still, head tilted slightly downward, resting without fully surrendering awareness. The children are deep in sleep. Their breathing is slow and synchronized, softened by layers of blankets and the steady heat from the stove. Occasionally one shifts slightly, then returns to stillness without waking. The cabin feels smaller again at this hour, not physically, but in perception. Everything unnecessary has been stripped away by darkness and quiet. Only essential elements remain visible or felt. Fire, shelter, breath, warmth. A documented pattern in several prairie settlement records suggests that deep winter nights often created a heightened sense of spatial awareness among inhabitants, where individuals became extremely sensitive to temperature differences and sound changes within enclosed spaces. You notice that now? A faint crack in wood, a soft shift in fabric, the almost inaudible movement of air near the stove. Everything registers more clearly because there is nothing competing with it. The stove remains steady, its heat concentrated but reliable. Occasionally a faint glow intensifies as internal embers find new oxygen, then softens again as the fire adjusts itself. You realize how much trust is placed in that single object. Not spoken, not questioned, just assumed. Outside snow continues falling without interruption, though it feels distant now, separated by layers of wood and warmth. It will continue reshaping the prairie overnight, covering paths, smoothing ridges, erasing yesterday's traces completely. Inside, nothing is erased. Everything is held. The woman exhales slowly, shifting deeper into rest without fully lying down. Her presence remains part of the room even in near sleep, as if awareness itself has become distributed among everyone inside. You feel your own thoughts thinning, not disappearing, just slowing. A lesser recorded detail from frontier accounts mentions that many prairie families described winter nights as times when thinking itself softened, where mental activity became less structured and more fluid due to prolonged quiet and limited sensory variation. That description feels accurate now. Thoughts no longer follow clear direction. They drifts, then pause, then drift again. The stove emits another soft settling sound. Wood adjusts inside iron. A quiet reminder that even fire changes constantly even when it appears steady. Outside wind briefly increases again, moving across the prairie in a long, smooth wave that passes over the cabin and continues beyond it. The structure responds with faint creaking sounds, then returns to stillness. No one reacts. The sound is expected, familiar, almost reassuring. You shift slightly, feeling warmth gather more heavily near your chest. Sleep approaches more fully now, not as a sudden drop, but as a gradual release of awareness. The edges of the room soften. The stove remains the clearest point of focus, its glow steady, its presence constant, its heat quietly holding the night together. And as your consciousness begins to fade gently into rest, the final impression you carry is not of cold or wind or the snow, but of enduring warmth gathered in a small wooden space surrounded by an immeasurable winter. The deepest part of the night feels different from earlier hours, as if the cabin has fully separated itself from the rest of the prairie. Everything outside has dissolved into a vast, unbroken silence, while everything inside has slowed into near stillness. You're barely awake now. Thoughts drift in soft fragments, no longer structured, just impressions of warmth, shadow and sound. The stove remains active in a reduced state, its glow dim but persistent, like a heartbeat that refuses to weaken. Occasionally a faint crackle passes through the iron body, followed by a small shift in embers that briefly brightens the room before settling again. The air inside feels thick with heat that has been built up over hours of continuous burning, yet even this warmth carries contrast. One side of the cabin remains comfortably heated, while corners near the walls retain a quiet lingering cold. That imbalance never disappears. It only changes intensity. Outside the prairie exists only as absence now. No shapes, no horizon, no movement visible through the windows. Even snow is no longer distinguishable except as occasional faint brightness when reflected light passes across it. Wind returns, briefly pressing against the cabin in a slow wave that moves along the walls and roof before fading again. The sound is distant, almost detached, like something passing through another layer of reality. Inside no one speaks, not because silence is required, but because speech no longer feels necessary. The woman rests in a half-seated position, her breathing slow and steady. The man remains still, head slightly tilted forward, entering the light, fragmented rest common during long winter nights. The children are deeply asleep, fully absorbed into warmth and blankets. You remain conscious just enough to notice everything. The stove's glow becomes your main reference point. Its faint red core pulses gently behind the iron door. Every so often a log shifts inward with a quiet collapse, producing a soft sound that seems amplified in the stillness. Each movement signals that fire continues even when everything else appears motionless. A number of surviving frontier settlement journals describe how winter nights often felt layered, where perception of time became irregular and fragmented due to extended darkness and limited external stimuli. You feel the pixels distortion. Now, minutes do not feel like minutes. They feel like stretches of stillness separated by small internal sounds. The stove, a breath, a faint creak in wood, then silence again. The cabin itself seems to settle deeper into the night. Wooden beams adjust slightly under shifting temperature. Fabric hangs motionless near hooks. Even the air feels less active, as if everything has agreed to pause together. Outside, snow continues falling steadily, not violently, not dramatically, just endlessly. It builds layer upon layer over the prairie, slowly transforming all visible terrain into smooth, uninterrupted white. Trails disappear, tracks vanish. Even familiar structures outside the cabin become unrecognizable under accumulation. Inside, however, nothing changes shape. Only warmth and shadow shift gently. You notice how your awareness becomes increasingly focused on small sensations. The heat near your chest, the cooler air near your legs, the subtle sound of fire adjusting itself. A lesser documented observation from prairie accounts suggests that prolonged winter isolation often led settlers to develop heightened sensitivity to household sounds, particularly those associated with heating systems and structural movement. That sensitivity feels natural here. Every sound carries meaning. Every silence feels intentional. The stove emits another quiet internal adjustment, a soft settling of fuel and ash. The glow responds briefly, then stabilizes again, maintaining its steady presence. The woman shifts slightly, then becomes still once more. Her presence remains part of the room, even in near sleep, as though awareness itself has diffused rather than disappeared. You feel yourself drifting closer to that same state. Thoughts become less distinct. Images blur at the edges. Time no longer feels structured. Outside wind passes once more across the prairie, this time weaker, less defined, almost like a memory of movement rather than movement itself. The cabin does not respond strongly, only a faint creak acknowledges it. Then stillness returns. The stove remains unchanged at its center. Not bright, not fading, just steady, holding warmth through the long unbroken night. And as your awareness softens further, the final sensation that remains is not cold or silence, but the quiet persistence of heat sustaining life inside a small wooden shelter surrounded by an immeasurable winter. The night feels like it has no clear center anymore, only layers of quiet stacked one over another, until time itself becomes difficult to separate from stillness. Inside the cabin, everything moves at the slowest possible rhythm, where even warmth feels like something gently breathing rather than actively burning. You're close to sleep now, not fully gone, but no longer firmly present either. The stove continues its steady work, reduced to a quiet core of heat behind iron. Its glow is faint, almost hidden unless you focus directly on it. Yet that small presence is enough to shape the entire room, defining shadows, distance, and comfort. Occasional soft sounds emerge from within the fire. A settling log, a small shift of ash, a brief crack that fades immediately into silence. Outside the prairie is completely erased by night and snow. There is no visual horizon, only an imagined sense of space extending far beyond the cabin walls. The wind no longer presses strongly. It passes instead in irregular distant movements that feel detached from immediate surroundings. Inside breath becomes the most noticeable rhythm. Slow, even, shared. The woman remains still in her chair. Her posture relaxed, but not fully collapsed into sleep. The man sits slightly forward, head lowered, as though maintaining a light awareness even in rest. The children are fully asleep, their forms nearly indistinguishable beneath layered blankets. You notice how sound behaves differently now. It does not echo. It does not spread. It simply exists where it is created, then vanishes. A faint creak passes through one of the cabin beams overhead, followed by a second softer one near the wall. These sounds are no longer surprising. They have become part of the structure of the night itself. Surviving homestead accounts from prairie settlements often describe how winter nights created a heightened awareness of structural sounds where settlers could distinguish between normal settling and weather-related pressure changes in the building frame. You understand that distinction instinctively now. The cabin feels alive in its own quiet whoa. Not in movement, but in response. The stove emits another low internal shift, followed by a brief pulse of warmth that spreads outward slightly before returning to equilibrium. That small fluctuation becomes the central event of the room even though nothing else changes. Time loses structure further. There are no markers left to measure it, only cycles of fire and stillness. You feel your awareness thinning, thoughts becoming less connected, drifting without direction. Images of earlier moments return briefly. Snow outside the window, morning light, the sound of boots in deep drifts. Then they dissolve again into darkness. Outside wind passes once more across the prairie. Not strong, not urgent, just present. It brushes against the cabin and fades without consequence, leaving behind only a faint suggestion of movement. Inside, nothing responds except the stove. It continues its steady presence, holding heat carefully within iron walls that have already endured countless cycles of burning and cooling. A lesser recorded detail from frontier diaries suggests that many prairie settlers came to view the stove not simply as a tool, but as a constant companion through winter nights, something that defined the boundary between survival and vulnerability. That idea feels less symbolic now, more practical, more immediate. The stove is warmth. The stove is safety. The stove is continuity. The woman shifts slightly, her breathing changing briefly before returning to its slow rhythm. The man remains still, his posture unchanged. The children continue sleeping, deeply unaffected by anything happening beyond their blankets. You are the only one still partially aware, and even that awareness is dissolving. The room feels increasingly distant, as if it is slowly moving away from you rather than you falling away from it. Firelight becomes softer. Edges blur. Sound fades into near silence. Up towards and the stove remains the last clear point of perception, its faint glow marking the center of everything still anchored in reality. Outside the prairie continues its invisible work of accumulation. Snow layers over the snow-forming depth that will only be revealed in the morning light. Inside the cabin holds steady against it all, wood fire breath and shadow remaining in fragile balance. And as sleep finally begins to take you fully, there is only one remaining sensation that stays with you, the steady warmth that persists quietly through the night, refusing to disappear even in the deepest cold. The night reaches its most complete silence now, the kind that feels almost complete enough to have weight. Inside the cabin, even perception itself seems softened, as if every sensation is wrapped in a thin layer of distance. You are drifting deeply. Thoughts no longer form full shapes, only fragments remain. Warmth, shadow, firelights, breath. The stove continues its quiet endurance, now reduced to a faint but steady glow. It no longer brightens the room, only marks its center. The iron body holds heat like memory, slowly releasing it into the surrounding air in measured patient waves. Occasionally a faint internal shift occurs. Wood settles, ash compresses. A small ember flares briefly, then returns to stillness. Each sound feels isolated, as if the cabin itself is listening carefully to its own existence. Outside the prairie remains completely hidden. There is no visible boundary between land and sky, only darkness layered over snow. Wind moves in distant, irregular patterns, sometimes present, sometimes absent, never fully dominant. Inside, everything has slowed to near stillness. The woman remains motionless in her chair, breathing evenly. The man is still, posture unchanged, resting in a state that is neither fully sleep nor fully wakefulness. The children are completely absorbed into deep sleep, their forms barely distinguishable beneath thick coverings. You notice how the cabin feels more unified now. Earlier in the day, it felt divided into functional spaces. Now it feels like a single enclosed system of warmth and quiet. A number of frontier settlement diaries describe this sensation during extreme winter nights as a form of contained living, where all activity, sound, and attention gradually converge toward a single focal point, usually the stove. That observation matches your experience exactly. Everything has converged, even awareness. The stove emits another soft adjustment sound, followed by a faint glow that briefly intensifies before settling again. That momentary change becomes the only event of significance in the entire room. Time is no longer structured. It is only presence, then absence, then presence again. Your body feels increasingly distant, as if it belongs less to you and more to the space around you. Warmth near your chest remains, while the cooler air near the edges of the room fades into irrelevance. Outside wind moves once more across the prairie. It does not press. It does not linger. It simply passes like something moving through an endless field without destination. The cabin barely responds. Only a soft wooden creak acknowledges its presence. Then stillness returns. Inside, the stove remains unchanged in its quiet persistence. Its glow is faint but stable, continuing its slow transformation of fuel into warmth without interruption. A lesser, recorded detail from frontier accounts suggests that during prolonged winter nights, settlers often developed a heightened sensitivity to the stove's presence, sometimes describing it as the only reliable indicator that life inside the cabin was still continuing normally. That idea feels increasingly accurate now. Everything depends on that steady glow. The woman shifts once more, barely perceptible, then becomes still again. The man remains in the same position, his breathing slow and even. The children continue sleeping without movement or sound. You are almost entirely within sleep now. Only a thin thread of awareness remains. It connects you to the room through the stove. Nothing else feels distinct. Even the walls seem to blur into a single enclosing shape, holding warmth inside and keeping cold outside without effort or tension. The stove emits one final subtle shift, a quiet settling of embers that produces a soft glow before returning to a steady low light. That moment feels like a closing rhythm, not an ending, just a continuation without change. Outside, snow continues to fall across the prairie unseen, but constant reshaping everything beyond the cabin into silence and accumulation. Inside, the cabin remains intact, warm and still, and as your awareness finally dissolves fully into sleep, there is only the gentle persistence of heat holding steady through the vast winter night without hesitation or decline. The night begins to loosen its grip, though it does not yet release the prairie. Inside the cabin, the air carries a faint suggestion of change, not from temperature, but from something deeper in the quality of darkness itself. The stove still burns, but its presence feels quieter now, as if it is preparing the room for transition rather than sustaining its center. You are close to sleep, yet awareness returns in soft waves. Not sharp, not sudden, just gradual. The fire has shifted into a low, steady state, glowing behind iron like a distant memory of flame. It no longer produces strong light, only a faint red suggestion that outlines nearby objects. The cabin feels more defined by shadow than illumination. Occasional movements occur inside the stove. A log settles inward. A pocket of ash collapses softly. A faint crack travels through the metal before fading into silence. Outside, the prairie remains unseen, but something in its presence feels slightly different. The wind has weakened further, moving in slower, less frequent patterns. Snow continues to fall, though more gently now, as if the storm itself is losing intensity after a long effort. Inside, the woman stirs faintly in her chair, then becomes still again. The man shifts slightly, adjusting his posture without fully waking. The children remain deeply asleep, their breathing steady and unbroken. The cabin holds its familiar rhythm, but now there is an underlying sense of anticipation. Not urgent, just subtle transition. Surviving homestead accounts from prairie settlements often describe early morning hours during winter storms as moments of gradual awareness where families would wake not from noise or movement, but from a change in atmospheric pressure inside the room as fire activity slowed and night approached its final stage. You begin to feel that shift now. The stove remains active but less dominant. Its heat still exists, though it no longer defines the entire room. Cooler air begins to reassert itself along the edges of the cabin, particularly near the floor and window seams. The contrast returns. Warm center, cold periphery. Outside wind passes once more, but it feels distant, almost detached from immediate surroundings. The prairie no longer feels active, only present in background motion. You notice how perception changes at this hour. Sounds that were once constant now feel rare. Silence is no longer heavy. It feels neutral. A lesser documented observation from frontier journals suggests that during late winter nights, settlers often experienced a transitional awareness where sleep and wakefulness overlapped for extended periods, especially in environments with limited artificial lighting and continuous stove heating. That state surrounds you now. Thoughts appear briefly, then dissolve before forming structure. You are no longer fully tracking time, only sensing it. The stove emits another small internal adjustment, a final quiet redistribution of heat within its body. The glow flickers slightly brighter for a moment, then settles into an even lower steady state. That change feels symbolic, though nothing about it is deliberate. Just physics continuing its course. The woman's breathing deepens, slightly shifting toward fuller sleep. The man remains still, his presence unchanged. The children do not move at all, fully absorbed in rest. The cabin feels unified again, but in a different way than earlier. Not centered around activity or warmth, but around continuity itself. Everything continues without interruption. Outside the prairie remains dark, but the sense of distance feels less oppressive now. The night is still present, but it no longer feels dominant. It feels like it is slowly yielding to something beyond it. Inside the stove becomes quieter, not weaker, just steadier and lower. A constant point of heat that no longer demands attention. You feel yourself drifting further away from structured thought. Images no longer form clearly. Sensations merge together. Warmth, shadow, and silence become indistinguishable in perception. The cabin remains intact around you, but your awareness of it softens as if it is no longer separate from you, but part of the same fading continuity. Outside, snow continues its slow accumulation, reshaping everything in unseen layers that will only become visible again when morning arrives. Inside, there is only this final suspended moment. Fire reduced to ember, breath slowed into rhythm, silence fully established, and as sleep finally takes the last remaining edge of awareness, the world narrows to a single quiet certainty that warmth still exists even when everything else has faded into night. The last part of the night feels different from everything before it. Not because anything changes suddenly, but because nothing seems to change at all anymore. The cabin exists in a state of deep, steady stillness, where even time feels softened into something almost unnoticeable. You are no longer fully aware in the way you were earlier. Thoughts arrive like distant echoes, then fade before forming shape. The stove remains active, but only just. Its glow is reduced to a faint ember light, barely illuminating the immediate space around it. Yet even in this diminished state, it continues to hold the room together, maintaining a quiet boundary between warmth and cold. Occasional tiny movements occur within it, a soft settling of ash, a faint internal shift of wood, a brief pulse of red that quickly returns to dimness. Outside, the prairie is completely hidden beneath night and snow. There is no visible horizon, no sense of distance, only an extended field of darkness littered over frozen land. The wind has nearly disappeared, reduced to rare gentle movements that pass without resistance. Inside, everything feels suspended. The woman sleeps more deeply now, her posture relaxed and still. The man remains in quiet rest, unmoving except for slow breathing. The children are fully absorbed in sleep, their small forms nearly motionless beneath thick blankets. The cabin feels unified in silence, not empty, not tense, just complete. Surviving prairie settlement records often describe this final stage of winter nights as moments where human awareness becomes deeply synchronized with environmental stillness, where households enter a shared rhythm of near silence broken only by fire and breath. You feel that synchronization now. Even awareness itself becomes slower, less defined, more diffuse. The stove emits one final gentle shift, a quiet settling of its remaining heat into a lower, steadier state. The glow is now barely visible, but it remains present like a quiet promise that warmth has not disappeared entirely. Outside, snow continues falling in soft, unbroken layers. It no longer feels like movement. It feels like accumulation itself, a gradual rewriting of the landscape that happens without sound or interruption. Inside the cabin, hold steady against it. Wood iron here. And cloth breath and shadow remain in fragile balance. There is no urgency left in the night, only continuation. Your thoughts no longer form complete sentences. They arrive as fragments of sensation. Warmth near your chest, the soft sound of fire, the distant presence of wind that no longer presses, only exists. Everything becomes quieter. Even silence feels quieter. A lesser documented observation from frontier diaries suggests that near dawn many settlers experienced a subtle shift in perception, where the boundary between sleep and environment softened, creating a sensation of being held within the space, rather than simply resting inside it. That sensation surrounds you now. The stove remains the final anchor of perception, its faint glow still marking the centre of the room, not bright, not fading, just continuing. And as your awareness finally dissolves completely into sleep, the cabin, the fire, the snow, and the vast prairie beyond all merge into a single quiet presence that holds steady through the end of night and into the beginning of morning. Sleep well,